Now, the Manchester bombing inquiry reported earlier this week. Douglas Murray has written this column about it this week, and he joins me now. Douglas, you've been following this for quite some time. What jumped out at you in this report?
Well, we learned a number of things. The inquiry finds the number of occasions on which Salman Abedi, the suicide bomber in question on the night of the Ariana Grande concert in 2017, the inquiry finds a number of occasions when he could have been identified and should have been identified, could have been stopped and should have been stopped. Now, inquiries like this, seems to me, having read a lot of them in my time, always are going to find faults. It's inevitable. There will be intelligence faults, there will be security faults, human error, and more. And this is no different to that extent. There's human error of a staggering kind. I mean, the most obvious being two members of the police who went for a kebab half an hour away when they were meant to be at the venue, and then ate their dinner in a secure room and basically weren't doing their job. There are things like that. But as I say in my column this week, the really disturbing thing about this inquiry by Sir John Saunders is something that is revealed by a single witness who worked for one of the security companies at the Manchester Arena on the night.
And can you tell us a bit more? This was Kyle Lawler, who was at the time an 18-year-old security guard paid £4.26 per hour.
Yeah. I mean, there's something should be said about this, by the way, which is these security companies, as we know from previous incidents, they add a sort of veneer of security. But basically, if anything serious happens, most of the time these companies are not fit for purpose. So they add a sort of feeling of security without actually providing it. And what I'm about to say, as I say in the piece, I don't want to criticise Mr. Lawler for this. He was a young man, and I can't imagine what he has on his conscience in relation to this. But he was at least honest to the inquiry. Kyle Lawler says that, like a number of other people on the night, he noticed Salman Abedi. He couldn't have failed to notice him in a way, because Salman Abedi was hanging around for more than an hour and a quarter by the entrance exits of the building. He was inside the building. He was struggling with a 32-kilogram rucksack, which we now know contained the bomb. And Kyle Lawler was one of the people on the night who noticed him, thought there was something up. And he says specifically that what he noticed about Mr. Abedi, going backwards and forwards, struggling with this extremely heavy backpack, was, he said, he had a nervous reaction whenever anyone looked at him and seemed fidgety. Now, that's not the important thing. The important thing is what Kyle Lawler said after this. He stated to the inquiry that he was fearful of identifying Mr. Abedi. He said he was fearful of being branded a racist and feared that he would be in trouble if he got it wrong. And as I say in my piece, one shouldn't blame Kyle Lawler for this. It is perhaps inevitable that some people would. But I admire the fact he was honest about it. He was honest about the fact that actually in modern Britain, quite understandably, he made the decision that if you see something, you shouldn't say something, you should shut up. Because there's far more to risk by saying something and being accused of being a racist than there is of not saying something and the bomb going off. That's a calibration that modern Britain has indoctrinated people into for many, many years, and you can't just indoctrinate people out of it.
When I was reading the report, I was really quite struck by the kind of strength of character that Kyle Lawler must have. I mean, I'm not sure in his situation. He was somebody who I think learnt his trade via an online course. So he had been given very little training, no real experience. Yet it would have been very easy for him just to pretend that he'd seen nothing, to not have anybody publicly blame him for missing something. Because of sort of some people will say, well, if only you'd blown the whistle. Of course, he's putting himself up there for criticism. I imagine, though, he's doing this to make a rather important point that a lot of people in his position would hesitate to blow the whistle for the reasons that he gives, that you might be branded discriminatory, and I guess the same is true for anybody who's in the security industry, because when you stop somebody who looks suspicious, I guess you do need to ask yourself, am I being biased here? To what extent is racial profiling morally acceptable when it comes to stopping people going through airports, through other shopping arenas? Right. This is a dilemma we've had ever since 9/11.
That's right. In fact, of course, as you know, we have an entire industry now in Britain, as across the rest of the Western world, which says that we've not just got biases, but they're inbuilt in us, they're implicit in us, and we have to eradicate them. We have to question our alleged biases. We've got to do double takes all the time mentally. This is a whole industry that vast swathes of government, the private sector and others have imbibed. And this isn't the reason why Salman Abedi got into it. That's just one further manifestation of the problem that Kyle Lawler has so sadly put his finger on. As you say, though, Fraser, this is a young guy who underwent very little training. He said that he had no particular knowledge there was going to be an incident on the night, which is true. He couldn't have known that. He could have known, he should have been told, that the terrorism threat in the UK was severe at the time. It was only shortly after the attack in Westminster, before, of course, the attack on London Bridge. But the terrorism risk status was at severe. But again, it's people much more senior than this very junior, online-trained security officer who I think have to take some responsibility for getting Britain into the position that you can't honestly identify somebody who you think might be a suicide bomber for fear of basically detonating your own career. And I mention in my piece several examples of high-profile police officers in Greater Manchester who set the scene for that. Because, as I mentioned in the piece, 1 year almost exactly before the Manchester Arena bombing, there was a test exercise at the Manchester shopping centre in which the local security services, the local emergency services, trained for basically an eventuality uncannily like the one on the night in the Manchester Arena. It was to test the preparedness of the first responders, of the emergency services, and the whole occasion was marred by a single detail, which is that the actor playing the suicide bomber on that occasion at the Manchester shopping centre shouted Allahu Akbar, or Allah is greatest, before detonating the fake device that then led to the play act and the attempt to prepare the emergency services. The whole exercise was forgotten about and massively marred by this fact, because there was an immediate backlash against the whole scenario for the person playing the suicide bomber shouting Allahu Akbar, and therefore totally appallingly, outrageously, unforgivably linking the possibility of a suicide bombing with Islamist extremism. And all of the local community leaders went off on this. How dare you make this connection? And the local police, people like the Greater Manchester Police and Crime Commissioner, Tony Lloyd, all apologised for it. They said it's outrageous. It's marred an otherwise successful event. And I think Tony Lloyd, the Greater Manchester Police and Crime Commissioner, said that this didn't add anything to the event, the shouting of Allahu Akbar. It just has the potential, he said, to undermine the great community relations we have in Greater Manchester. So this is the position that people like Kyle Lawler found themselves on the night that there was a real-time suicide bomber really standing in front of them, under their noses, struggling with a 32-kilogram bomb. They had been told by every major policeman in the area that you should do nothing to link these things, and that is why we had effectively trained people out of identifying what was under their noses.
Right. At the time, as you say, Douglas, the threat level was number 3, but right now it's number 2, substantial. It seems that in the last 20 years there's hardly been many times where there hasn't been a kind of a threat. And yet, so you can understand why the security guard didn't quite know what they wouldn't have been really expecting one of these attacks. But you also have to wonder just how much you can really expect out of relatively junior people who are, I mean, you know, you could see probably somebody senior, perhaps a soldier or something, might be able to work that thing out. But even with the Metropolitan Police, I've had lots of problems with stop and search. They've been accused of racially profiling black Londoners. Theresa May told them to stop it. And it can be a very difficult balance to get right, because if you go too much, and of course you end up with a system where people of Asian or Middle Eastern outlook get asked for their ID, even in the House of Commons here, a lot more than white. So you can see why there is concern of taking this a bit too far in certain circumstances.
Well, what happens here is that the balance swings too far in one direction. And we have to accept the fact that in 2017, the profile of a suicide bomber at a pop concert pretty much exactly fitted the profile of Salman Abedi, a young, radicalized male of North African or Middle Eastern descent. This was pretty much the likely person. It was not a woman. It was not a white woman. It was a particular profile. And you might say, well, you know, you've got to check 20 people who don't fit the profile in order to allow yourself to check one person who does fit the profile. But as we saw on the night in Manchester, these sorts of games are ones you can treat yourself to until it gets really serious. And the Manchester Arena bombing was an unbelievable event, and it should never be forgotten. It's been, to some extent, I've always said, slightly brushed over, I have to say, when you consider the amount of attention that some outrages get. The extraordinary way in which it's sort of been, you know, brushed over. Almost from the beginning, we had the whole don't look back in anger sort of thing about it. This whole don't draw any lessons out from it. And by the way, there are still lessons we don't know. We just don't know answers to very major questions, even after the Saunders report. I give an example in my column this week of something we still don't know. Salman Abedi's parents came to the UK in the 1990s. The father was a member of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which subsequently joined Al-Qaeda, joined up with Al-Qaeda as an affiliate. The father of Salman Abedi was in the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and they fell out with Colonel Gaddafi in the 1990s. Very sadly, these people fell out with each other. And so Britain gave sanctuary to the Abedi parents. And that's how young Salman Abedi was born in the UK. He was born because we gave his parents asylum. And Salman Abedi and his utterly reprehensible brother were the gifts we got in Britain for this. I still can't find, after all this time and even after this review, any explanation from any official in the UK as to why this happened. Why did we give them asylum? What did we gain from it? What exactly, other than two appalling sons, did they give to this country or bring to this country? Nothing. Nada. Zilch. And yet nobody in authority has ever yet given an explanation for this, let alone been held accountable for this. And this is one of the things I still find absolutely astonishing in the British discussion of this. We always get in the UK, as I've written at The Spectator many times, we always get these sort of slightly fake debates. You know, to my mind, stop and search is a relatively comfortable debate compared to some of the other debates that we ought to have. Why was it that the Abedi family were in the UK? Why was it that in the London Bridge attack, only weeks later, 2 of the 3 attackers had, as far as I can understand, no legitimate cause for being in the UK? One had lied about his nationality, was found out to have lied, and then anyway wasn't deported from the UK, and the other was somebody who claimed asylum from Pakistan a few years ago. Why was the UK giving asylum to somebody from Pakistan in the late 1990s or early 2000s? Why was it that when somebody pretends to be a Moroccan, turns out to be a Libyan, hacks at women's throats on London Bridge, bridge while shouting Allahu Akbar, that nobody's much interested in what he's doing here in the first place. And all of the crappy security supremos get onto the comfortable debates. They get onto things like, to what extent is online radicalisation an issue? Because it's so much easier to talk about these crappy third-rate issues of what you can do with Google and so on. It's so much easier than just those basic elementary questions. There has never been an asking of those elementary questions. There still hasn't been. And I think it points to the failures we still have, even after all these years in the UK, of properly discussing what is a serious security threat that's ongoing.
But one potential answer there, Douglas, is that we gave him, I don't know the details, but at the time Colonel Gaddafi wasn't exactly running a benign regime. You could certainly see why somebody might be fleeing in fear of their life from that regime. And like most European countries...
You can definitely see that. You can definitely see that.
So that's what he was doing in the country. That question is relatively easy to answer. That question should be relatively easy to answer, but there will be probably thousands of other Libyan refugees who've led constructive lives brought into the country.
I'm not at all sure that the British taxpayers' money is well spent in giving asylum to jihadists who've fallen out with other jihadists. I mean, it's possible we could decide to be the great convening centre, some people would argue we have been in recent decades, for the sort of, intra-jihadist fallout community. But I don't think that's what the British public ever wanted. I know it's something we were never asked about. So yes, there are explanations, and I'd like to hear them, and I'd like them to be stressed by the officials. I'd like them to justify their decisions. I'd like them to explain to the British public why it seems there are so many cases of people who've gone on to commit terrorist acts who, as far as I can see, gave Britain nothing and took, in the case of Salman Abedi, 22 young lives.